Do you remember how long a single summer used to last when you were 7 years old? It felt like an endless ocean of days, a vast, unmappable territory where a single afternoon could contain an entire lifetime of discovery. But now, look at your calendar. Months dissolve into weeks, years slip away like water through your fingers, and before you can even process the change of seasons, another year has died. Time is not actually moving faster. The clocks on our walls are ticking at the exact same cosmic rate. Yet your mind is trapped in a terrifying, accelerating illusion. You are not just growing older, you are watching your universe shrink in real time. Today, we look into the dark mathematics of your mind to answer a haunting question. Why does the older you get, the faster you die? 1. The real-world phenomenon of time perception differences between children and adults. Human beings are universal victims of a shared cognitive asymmetry. When we are children, the arrival of a birthday or a major holiday like New Year feels like an exhausting, distant horizon. A child waiting for Christmas is a study in agonizing patience. Each week feels like a monumental epoch, and a single school year is perceived as a massive, almost permanent chapter of existence. Children live in a state of chronological abundance. Every single day is stretched out, dense with minutes that refuse to pass. But a profound and unsettling shift occurs as we cross the threshold into adulthood. The temporal brakes fail. The long, winding road of childhood turns into a steep, uncontrollable freefall. Suddenly, you find yourself uttering the exact same phrase every single December. Where did the time go? The transition from one year to the next no longer feels like a grand journey. It feels like a repetitive, mechanical blink. This is not a casual observation. It is a terrifying subjective truth. As an adult, you are systematically robbed of the slow, rich experience of duration that you possessed effortlessly in your youth. The seasons change before you have even fully registered the current one, creating a persistent underlying anxiety that your life is slipping away while you are looking right at it. To understand this phenomenon, cognitive scientists point to a fundamental concept known as temporal distortion. This psychological reality states that time as a physical measurement, dictated by the rotation of the Earth and the decay of atoms, is completely decoupled from time as a psychological experience. Our brains do not possess an internal stopwatch that measures SI units of seconds. Instead, the mind constructs its own version of time based on the intensity and volume of internal processing. A famous historical validation of this subjective distortion can be found in the pioneering work of French underground explorer Michel Siffre in the mid-20th century. Siffre chose to live isolated in a deep, subterranean ice cave for months at a time, completely devoid of clocks, calendars, or natural sunlight. He ate when he was hungry and slept when his body demanded it. When he finally emerged from the cave, after what he objectively calculated to be less than 2 months, his internal psychological clock was drastically warped. He believed he had been underground for a vastly different period. His mind, stripped of external reference points and starved of fresh environmental stimuli, had completely rewritten the fabric of duration. This experiment proved that without constant external anchors, the human mind is entirely incapable of tracking objective time. In the daily life of an adult, our routines act like Siffre's cave. We become blind to the true passage of time because our internal processing mechanics alter how the data of reality is recorded. The long-term consequence of this psychological distortion is a state of existential acceleration. Because adults perceive each block of time as progressively shorter, they experience a sensation of shrinking life capacity. If a year feels like a month, then a decade feels like a year. This compression creates a profound sense of urgency, often manifesting as midlife crises or chronic existential dread. Adults begin to feel like passengers in a vehicle that is constantly picking up speed, heading toward a definitive cliff without any access to the brakes. We become spectators to our own rapid obsolescence, watching our most valuable, non-renewable asset vanish at a perceived velocity that grows more aggressive with every single passing birthday. 2. Explaining the phenomenon through the timeline formula and the mathematical law of proportions. The most elegant, yet utterly devastating explanation for this acceleration is found not in poetry but in pure unyielding mathematics. This is known as the proportionality theory of time, originally conceptualized by the philosopher Paul Janet in 1897. Janet argued that the human mind evaluates the length of any given period of time by comparing it directly to the total span of existence we have already lived. Time is not an absolute value. It is a fraction where the denominator is your current age. Let us break down this cosmic equation to see how it ruthlessly diminishes your life. Consider a child who is exactly 1 year old. To that infant, a single year is not just a collection of months. It is 100% of their entire lived experience. It represents the totality of everything they have ever known, felt, seen, or understood. Therefore, the upcoming year carries an immense absolute psychological weight. It is equivalent to a whole lifetime. Now project this mathematical reality onto a child who has reached the age of 10. For this 10-year-old, a single year is no longer the totality of existence. It is now exactly 1/10 or 10% of their life. The wait for the next birthday is still significant, but it is structurally 10 times shorter in their internal matrix than it was when they were 1. The denominator has grown, and therefore the value of the single unit has shrunk. As the biological clock keeps ticking, the mathematics of the proportionality theory become increasingly hostile to our perception. By the time an individual reaches the age of 20, a single year compresses down to just 5% of their total lived experience. The year has lost half of its subjective value compared to when they were a decade younger. Fast forward to the age of 50. At this mature stage of development, An entire 12-month cycle constitutes mere 2% of the individual's total lifetime. A year is no longer a vast territory to be explored. It is a tiny, insignificant, fractional sliver appended to a massive mountain of past existence. The mind processes this 2% as a minor, routine update rather than a major epoch. The profound system logic of this mathematical law leads to a radical, counterintuitive cognitive twist. It means that our life stages are not perceptually equal in length, even if they are numerically identical on paper. The mathematical relationship dictates that the subjective difference between the ages of 5 and 10 is completely identical to the subjective difference between the ages of 40 and 80. Let that sink in. The tiny 5-year window of your late childhood from age 5 to 10 felt just as long, just as dense, and just as monumental as the massive 40-year span of your later adult life from age 40 to 80. You live half of your perceived life before you even finish school. The numerical symmetry of time is a massive cosmic lie. The first quarter of your chronological life consumes the vast majority of your psychological time, leaving the remaining decades to fly past in a hyper-compressed mathematical blur. 3. An in-depth analysis of the brain's memory processing mechanism, the difference in information density. The mathematical compression of time is heavily reinforced by a biological reality inside our skulls. Your brain does not record reality like a continuous unedited video camera. Instead, it operates like a highly selective editor, only saving clips that it deems crucial for your survival and adaptation. This is governed by the relationship between working memory, cognitive load, and the density of new information. When you are young, your brain is in a state of hypervigilance. Every object, every sound, every social interaction is a brand new data point. When a child sees a thunderstorm, watches a spider spin a web, or enters a new school, their brain goes into overdrive to process this unfamiliar sensory input. The neural pathways are firing rapidly, creating dense, highly detailed memory files. In cognitive psychology, this is known as high informational density, because the brain spends an enormous amount of metabolic energy encoding these detailed frames. When you look back at your childhood, the retrospective timeline feels incredibly long. You are looking at a hard drive packed with massive, high-definition files. As we transition into adulthood, our relationship with reality undergoes a quiet, efficient catastrophe. The brain is a fundamentally lazy organ. Its primary evolutionary goal is to conserve energy. To do this, it builds cognitive schemas, mental shortcuts that group familiar experiences together. By the time you are 30 or 40, you have seen thousands of rainy days, driven to work a chunchier millions of times, and eaten the same meals over and over. Your brain no longer needs to process the fine details of these events. It recognizes the pattern, assigns it a generic template, and essentially goes into a state of neural sleep. This can be clearly demonstrated through the famous psychological phenomenon known as the first-time effect, or the oddball effect. In laboratory settings, scientists present subjects with a series of identical repetitive stimuli, for instance, a flashing blue circle on a screen every second. After a few repetitions, the subject's brain activity drops significantly. It has adapted to the pattern. However, if the scientists suddenly insert an oddball stimulus, like a flashing red square, the subject's brain activity spikes instantly. More importantly, when asked to estimate the duration of the images, subjects consistently report that the unique, unexpected red square stayed on the screen much longer than the repetitive blue circles, even though their physical duration was exactly identical. In adulthood, your daily life is a continuous loop of repetitive blue circles. The commute to work, the sitting at a desk, the scrolling through social media, these are all low-density data points. The brain compresses these redundant experiences into a single tiny folder. When you look back at the past 6 months of a highly routine adult life, your brain finds almost no unique data points to retrieve. The retrospective timeline collapses because there are no landmarks. You feel like the year flew by because, from the perspective of your memory storage, almost nothing actually happened. For the role of life milestones and the repetitive nature of adult life loops, the loss of time is not just a biological failure. It is a structural byproduct of modern societal organization. The architecture of human life is heavily front-loaded with distinct monumental milestones. The first decade and a half of your existence is a masterclass in psychological punctuation. You have the first day of kindergarten, learning to ride a bike, moving to middle school, hitting puberty, getting a driver's license, your first romantic relationship, and graduating from high school. Each of these events serves as a massive psychological anchor in your personal history. They split your timeline into distinct, easily identifiable epochs. You can differentiate between when I was 12 and when I was 14 because the external landscape of your life was completely different. But once you enter the arena of stable adulthood, the milestone factory shuts down. For the vast majority of people, the timeline flattens into a long, featureless highway. You get a job, and that job remains relatively static for 5, 10, or 20 years. Your weekly routine becomes highly predictable. The weekends become a brief, desperate attempt to recover before the loop resets on Monday morning. The sharp, well-defined boundaries of your youth melt into a blurry, homogeneous smear of survival and routine. This lack of psychological anchors has a devastating effect on how we perceive our own history. Without milestones to mark the passage of time, our internal sense of duration loses all its reference points. It is the psychological equivalent of driving through a vast, featureless desert at 80 miles per hour. Because there are no trees, buildings, or mountains passing by your window, you have absolutely no visual sensation of speed. You feel like you are standing still until you look down at the odometer and realize you have traveled hundreds of miles. The long-term consequence of this flatlined existence is a psychological state called temporal monotony. When every day looks like yesterday and next week promises to look exactly like this week, the brain stops paying attention to the passage of time entirely. Years do not pass one by one, they pass in blocks of 5 or 10. You wake up one day and realize you have been at the same desk in the same routine for an entire decade, yet your mind processes that decade as if it were a single uninterrupted afternoon. The structural repetition of adult life acts as a cosmic accelerator, stealing our years by rendering them completely indistinguishable from one another. 5. The impact of neurobiology, dopamine decline, and the internal biological clock. Beyond mathematics and memory storage, the acceleration of time is driven by a harsh, inevitable decay within our neurotransmitters and cellular biology. As the human body ages, its internal pacemaker physically slows down, creating a profound mismatch with the fixed speed of the external universe. The primary chemical currency of time perception in the human brain is dopamine. Dopamine is not just the molecule of pleasure. It is the fundamental gating mechanism for how we measure intervals of existence. When dopamine levels are high, your internal neural clock runs fast. It ticks at a rapid frequency, taking thousands of metabolic snapshots per minute. When your internal clock ticks faster than the objective world, external time feels like it is moving in slow motion. This is precisely why children whose brains are saturated with baseline dopamine experience a slow, expansive reality. Their neural cameras are capturing a high frame rate of the universe. However, clinical research in neurobiology confirms that starting in early adulthood, the human brain suffers a progressive linear decline in both dopamine production and the density of dopamine receptors. We lose approximately up to 10% of our dopamine receptors per decade. As dopamine levels drop, your internal neural clock physically slows down. It becomes sluggish, taking fewer snapshots of reality per second. This creates a devastating psychological inversion. Because your internal clock is ticking slower, the objective world appears to be moving much faster by comparison. It is the exact mechanical equivalent of filming a scene with a low frame rate camera. When you play the footage back at normal speed, everything on screen appears in fast forward. You are not experiencing more reality. Your brain is simply taking fewer samples of it. This neurological slowdown is compounded by a decrease in the body's baseline metabolic rate and core body temperature as we age. In the early 19th century, the physicist and physician Ernst Poppel discovered that our perception of time is intimately tied to our biological pacing. A child's heart beats faster, their cells divide quicker, and their neural networks operate at a higher metabolic temperature. To a child, a physical minute contains a massive amount of biological actions. As you age and your metabolism degrades, your biological processes slow down. Because your internal processing units take longer to execute commands, more objective time slips past outside before your brain can complete a single cycle of internal reflection. You are physically lagging behind the universe, and that lag is perceived subjectively as the terrifying acceleration of your life. The mathematical, neurological, and structural forces of aging are engineered to speed up your demise, but you are not entirely powerless against this illusion. If you want to slow down time, you must stop feeding the machine of repetition. You must consciously force your brain to create new neural landmarks, break the routine. Learn a complex instrument, travel to a completely unfamiliar environment, or pivot your career into uncharted territory. Force your mind into a state of high informational density once again. You cannot stop the physical clocks from ticking, but you can change the fractional weight of the years you have left. Do not let your life become a single forgotten folder of compressed data. Look at your daily routine right now. Is it an open book of exploration or a repetitive loop that is erasing your existence? Drop a comment below with the one routine you are going to break this exact week to reclaim your time. Subscribe to Shadow Psychology DD and stop letting your universe shrink in the dark.